Alright, hello. So this is going to be a quick, much shorter than normal remedy to 2 weeks ago, in which the audio for my end was a bit bugged. For some reason it detected my microphone had been disconnected when it was very much plugged in. So I'm just going to be doing a quick remedy, going over the tier lists that we formulated together as mentors, and just going over why each unit is in its place. I'm going to start off with Cathay. First we're looking at D tier. The peasant horsemen, they're fast and they can pose a good distraction to most range units. The main issue they have in Warhammer 3 is the fact that there isn't really anything they can beat. When it comes to beatable units, it's really like narrowed down to pretty much peasant archers on the opposing matchup with Cathay, because there's so many demons and all the Kislev infantry is hybrid, and then there's ogres. They can't kill anything, so the very best they can chase stuff off. Which is why you'd be inclined just to bring a better cav 99% of the time. Crane gunners are just worse Jezzails. They have very, very minimal damage output, and they are very, very susceptible to all kinds of damage. Again, it runs into the problem of coming up against demons or coming up against other cavalry in Cathay or Kislev. They just get torn to shreds and end up not doing pretty much like anything at all. I think this one is either the Sky Junk or the Sky Balloon. It's the one without the rockets, which is why it's bad. The little missiles that fire off do very minimal damage, and you have to rotate it in order to do its maximum amount of damage. It does provide a small buff in an AoE, and I think it improves Yang effectiveness, or it might be the other one. But overall, it's so weak to other flying units because it has no melee stats to speak of. Well, it does, but it's like 9 and 10, so it's not very high at all. That's why that's so low down on the list. The Woozing War Compass, you can get one of these if you really want to use one of these. You can get a Astromancer for a very similar cost, and with overall better outputs. The main issue is that its spells that it comes with aren't bound. They are just like you use your Winds of Magic whenever you cast spells from the Woozing War Compass, which is a huge detriment. You don't want to be using up your own Winds of Magic. If you want to use your Winds of Magic, use it on a sorcerer. Don't use it on a Woozing Compass. That can't do anything in melee. It's called a chariot. It is not a chariot. Now, the rocket battery for Cathay has its uses against, especially in the mirror match. The issue is that it's a bit overpriced for something that is a worse Hellstorm rocket battery that doesn't actually do that much damage. Not to mention that it's also very vulnerable to everything. It loses to any type of cannon, and it also gets run over by everything. Of course, a solid artillery piece really good at dealing with those clumps of infantry. It's not armor piercing as well, which is an issue, because the main armored infantry you'd want to be taking out was stuff like Khorne infantry, which is very heavily armored. So overall, if you want to take out lightly armored infantry, you're much better just sticking to the crossbowmen or the archers of Cathay. The Celestial Dragon Guard, these guys are very expensive infantry, which is mainly the issue. They're a very expensive tight formation infantry, which means they can get like destroyed in various circumstances, whether that be by a big explosion spell or by a rain of gunfire or so forth and so on. And very much similar with the crossbow variant as well that you can get, is that when you just have such an expensive unit so tightly packed together, it's just such a nice target just to hit with something really hard, because you end up getting full value back no matter the amount. Not to mention that there isn't actually that many targets for these guys. Like, the best you could come up with would be some large demon or like an elemental bear, none of which are usually brought against Cathay anyway, just because of how many missiles they have. You're much more likely to be fighting like bloodletters, which these guys don't do very well against, or like Slanesh Cav or ogres. Well, I suppose ogres don't quite count, but the fact that they're infantry just means they either get stomped by something larger or they get blown up by spells and magic. The larger balloon is better because it comes with what is for some reason a just more powerful version of the rocket. On top of that, it's not that much more expensive, and it does come with a bomb feature as well. That's the only reason why it's put above the... I think this one's the Skylight and that one's the Sky Junk. Could be wrong, could be the other way around. I don't use them. I don't think many people do use them, unironically. It's because of that, it's only slightly better than the other one. But it is better, which is why it's important to differentiate those two. Next, the Jade Lancers. These guys are actually a pretty decent cavalry. They're pretty much identical to Empire Knights, apart from they get the Yin and Yang effect, which is only really taken into play when you're playing defensively, but it's still there. And yeah, they're Empire Knights. They're pretty solid cav, all in all. Mostly to be used defensively to react to situations where they needed, like up against hounds or enemy cav or flanking maneuvers or a flying unit coming down. But they're a very solid cav with good armor and good shock charges. The handgunners, these guys are lots of peasants with guns. They fulfill all the AP you need compared to the more elite infantry, but they're a lot cheaper and they have a lot more volume of fire. So these guys are what you want to bring when you're dealing with the large, big monsters that aren't usually brought that much against Cathay, but you can see sometimes. So if you do want to deal with those, or you want to deal with like really slow Nurgle stuff, these guys are the guys to bring. In terms of countering armor, these guys, the Celestial Dragon Guards with crossbows, they're just way too expensive for the AP that they provide. These guys are nice and cheap. And even though their rolls are about the same, at least these guys are cost efficient for the usage, because you don't really see the good at melee prospect used so often in this unit. You don't want to be using your big expensive ranged unit in melee, even if it says it's good in melee. And if you end up using all the ammo in your big expensive ranged unit, the enemy's probably doing something wrong. Next, the Jade Warrior crossbows. These are the unshielded variant. These guys, pretty good volume of fire because each one of their models fire twice in one volley, things that like Shades do. They don't have AP, but again, the volume of fire was quite nice. Basically, very much along the lines of they are just the worst of the three options. Like the shielded variant that you will get onto later has the counter to missiles, and the peasant archers are just cheaper and more volume of fire. But these guys by no means bad. These guys can go up against whatever situation you need them in. Jade Warriors with halberds. Again, this AP-ness isn't that needed in the fact that all the demon rosters don't have that much armor. So the fact that they have AP, not to mention having halberds, means you just the animations are a lot slower, so they end up having a lot less damage output than the peasant spearmen can. And of course, they're just more expensive as well compared to like regular Jade Warriors or the peasant spearmen, which we'll get onto. Because of that, they're more B middling than they are top tier, I think. Regular Jade Warriors with Sword and Shield, these guys are very solid. With all their defensive buffs that they can get stacked, they can get up to like 50 or so melee defense. Very solid infantry. Pretty much what you're going to be bringing is your front line in every matchup except from Ogre Kingdoms. Very solid infantry. There's nothing really too much to complain about other than the fact that they have such a tight formation that they are again a bit vulnerable to those explosions of magic. It's just that these guys are nowhere near as expensive, so if they do get blown up, it's like, who cares? Oh my god, I forgot what these guys are called. 1 second. They're the Flying Pegasus reskin. Where's the name? It's something with a Y. I know that. Where is it? Come on. Oh, it's Longma Riders. Why do I think it was Y? Yeah, the Great Longma Riders. These guys are basically Pegasus Knights with more armor and no anti-large, from what I remember. I've got the unit card here. Yeah, they have Yang as well, which again you might want to be using defensively because of that, because you want them to stick near your ranged units. These guys are really good. For the same reasons that Jade Lancers are good, but these guys can get over rough terrain because they're flying and they're way faster. So these are your rapid response units. These are dealing with Furies. These are dealing with all of those issues that really can compromise your really nice ranged units really quickly. So it's great to have these guys in an army, even if it's just to block off a unit of enemy cav or to murder a unit of hounds and Furies. Now they are quite expensive, of course, so you're not going to be bringing a ton of these, but you almost, I think in every demon matchup, probably against ogres as well. I'd say it's only really against Kislev you don't bring these guys too much. Even in the mirror you'd bring these guys. It's just they're so good at moving rapid response, blocking off enemy flanks, so and so, and also if the enemy's not flanking, getting into the enemy ranged units. Jade Warrior crossbows with shields. These guys, while they are a better version, it's mainly because they serve a different niche. The shield gives them more melee defense and ranged parry chance. Because of that, you'd typically be using them against missile factions like Zinch, Grand Cathay, and Kislev. But that's the only 3 factions you'd bring these against. If you're going against the other 3, that being Nurgle, Khorne, or Slaanesh, you'd be better off just bringing the regular variant. It's just because these guys fill the niche that needs to be done, that they do better. And when it comes to facing up against the other 3, you would just bring Peasant Archers instead, because Peasant Archers just have, for their price, they're a lot more cost efficient. They can put out a lot more damage relative to their price compared to regular Jade Crossbowmen. Sure, they're weaker in melee, and they also have less armor, but against those three factions of Khorne, Nurgle, I mean Slaanesh, you're just going to have your ranged units run over anyway, but hypothetically speaking, Slaanesh, you would bring the non-shielded variants of either the crossbowmen or the peasant archers. Here, the peasant archers, I think, are better than regular Jade crossbowmen, but in those matchups against other ranged units, you'd bring the shielded variant of the Jade crossbowmen. So against Tzeentch, not really ogres, they don't really count, because a shield's not going to save you from a lead belcher shot, let me just tell you that much. Or Kislev, you'd bring the shielded variant. So you've really just got two sides of the same coin. For half the factions you bring this one, for the other half you bring this one. Now the peasant longspearmen, these guys are a really, really big unit of nice and cheap spears, which is really what Cathay needs. And they do surprisingly well. I forget what their anti-large bonus is, but I know it's very large. And when you put that in tandem with their yin and yang bonus and their like defensive bonuses, they can get melee stats that are really, really high for their cost when they're fighting large units. A lot of people tend to underestimate these, but if you can give them a good leadership buffs, and you can maybe give them immediate psychology via like Miao Ying, they can easily kill even like heavily elite cav. Even against like juggernauts, these guys will do like a lot of damage, which is quite amusing to see some peasant spearmen kill giant metal monsters. So yeah, these are, I say, Jade Warriors, Peasant Longspearmen, those are your best melee units, and then the Jade Crossbowmen with shields, and the Peasant Archers, those are your best ranged units in terms of ranged missile infantry. Then the Longmar Riders are your best cavalry, and then the best two units for Cathay, in my opinion, are the Grand Cannons. The Grand Cannons just have really, really good damage output for their cost. They are the cheapest artillery. I forget how much they are. They're like a 900 mark, I think, maybe less. And they're pretty much cannons, but they do more damage, and they're really at home in the current, well, matchup, against the current matchups. Against all the demon factions, they can take out those large units, they can take out enemy cavalry, and they force the demons to really rush at you, really try and get in there, and they can often be used to bait out Furies. If you stick a unit of Jade Warriors on these guys, you can almost guarantee that the Furies will just drop onto the Jade Warriors and lose. And they can really pay for themselves quite easily. Even if just the first couple of volleys, if they hit the right target, they can challenge any Great Unclean One, anything along those lines. And even against infantry, despite being a cannon, they tear apart Khorne Warriors, which Cathay has a problem dealing with sometimes. All kinds of enemy elite infantry against like other artilleries like lead belchers or iron blasters, they'll outshoot. These guys are just the best, really, in almost every matchup, I'd say, apart from like maybe Slaanesh. And maybe Tzeentch as well, because it's not worth shooting there. You'd probably want to bring a Grand Cannon, because just how well they perform for their cost. They do typically pay for themselves before the enemy can even reach them. Terracotta Sentinel is another one I put in S tier. Works really well as just a good holding centre single entity. They have a huge amount of health as well as a huge amount of armour, and they have damage output equivalent to that of like a giant, which is, it's basically a fast moving armoured giant, which is what everyone wanted since like they first came out in Warhammer 1. Very, very, very powerful. Not to mention that they can also be healed by Miao Ying. If you pair Miao Ying with two of these, it's a pretty unstoppable trio if the enemy doesn't have ranged units. Like fighting Khorne, that's like the meta, I think. Fighting Nurgle, I think it's pretty much the same, except for Nurgle's so slow you can just shoot them to death. But two Terracotta Sentinels and Miao Ying, that's one of the most powerful trios aside from like cultist spam that you can get. And it really is Cathay's version of a cultist. It's a big single entity that is getting a lot for its value. It has a bunch of health and it's really hard to kill because just how much health it has, how much armor, health, and all kinds of stats. So yeah, that's the Cathay roster and my opinions on each of the units and why I put them in those places. If we switch over to Ogres, the old Ogre roster, starting at the bottom, the poor two little Stonehounds. These guys are at the bottom purely and simply because you could just get a Hunter. Really not much other reason these two at the bottom. They're just a Hunter on a Stonehorn. You don't typically have much reason why you wouldn't. I don't think there's any matchup you'd bring like two Stonehorns. So even if you want a caster as well as a Hunter on a Stonehorn, that's like perfectly normal. Like, you're not going to be wasting your hero slot. It's the two Stonehorns. It's not that the Stonehorns are super bad. It's just that relative to the rest of the Ogre roster, this is the worst there is. Like, the Ogre roster is pretty strong, which we'll get onto later, especially comparable to the Cathay roster. And while there aren't as many standout units, they're just a lot of consistently good. I think Ogre Kingdoms was one of the harder ones to rank just because how everything close together it is. But in terms of like how good something is and how standout and how much of a use something has, the two different stone horns, you'd better off just bringing a hunter. The hunter can have way more utility, and I think you can actually get him for cheaper if you drop all of his items. So yeah, Stonehorn's just at the bottom purely simply because there's things that are better, and you can just bring a hunter. Onto C tier, the man-eaters with great weapons are very expensive and very predictable is the word I'd use, in the fact that when you're fighting ogres, you expect a big, not super armored but kind of armored and unshielded entities, and so what the enemy will typically do is prepare for that. Man-eaters are playing it, man-eaters with great weapons specifically play very much into that, because they're a big target that's very expensive that has no shield, so they will be shot to pieces or they will be killed by anti-large infantry. If you happen to come across something that's anti-large, that's large, like let's say Soul Grinder of Slanesh, then sure, these guys will do well. These guys, of course, because they're a monstrous infantry with anti-large, but just because they're a monstrous infantry, frankly, if you manage to surround a single entity, they will kill them. But they will not trade nearly as well against cavalry and other monstrous infantries as you might think. So you would normally just bring these guys to deal with single entities, but there is better options for that, in terms of their pistol variant, or just cavalry, or lead belchers or iron blasters. It's for this much cost, you're not getting a fast unit, you're not getting a very survivable unit. It's just not that worth it. They're good in the situations where you have an opponent that just sort of stands there. Gorgers, these guys have a lot more utility, but unfortunately their power was brought a lot down in their recent nerfs, and they have sort of been overshadowed because of that. In terms of what they bring to the table, the only reason you bring Gorgers as opposed to a regular man-eater unit is the fact that they have stalk and they're faster. They're also unbreakable, but that's not always the good thing in these circumstances. They have the anti-infantry bonus, but that's negligible compared to man-eater stats. Now there is plays to be made where you can use Gorgers to flank round, sneak into enemy ranged units and stuff, which is pretty much why they're at C tier, is where you use Gorgers in that regard, and you can still use them with Scrag, hypothetically. It's just that is a lot worse than they used to be. It's a lot better just to bring Scrag on his own these days than it is to bring him with any man-eater units. So yeah, they're just down at C. I was tempted to move them up to a low B, but I wanted to differentiate the fact that I think man-eaters, regular man-eaters, which you see on the B tier here, and the Iron Fisted variant of the man-eaters are just better than Gorgers at the moment, in terms of the fact that they're actually not that slow, so you can typically flank with them as you would with Gorgers. The Noblar Scrap Launcher, this is an unarmor-piercing single-entity giant catapult that's also a chariot, similar to how the Iron Blaster works. It's okay against those lightly armoured infantry, which are really clumped up, but that's not really something the ogres struggle to deal with. That's something that every single regular ogre bulls do what the scrap launcher does, but for way cheaper, and you also don't have to dedicate something to being defended in the back line. There are also plenty of spells that ogres get access to that pretty much does the same thing that the single catapult does from the Noblar Scrap Launcher. And there just isn't that many units that you'd want to use this on in the current matchup. There's Cathay, but the issue is Cathay have cannons, so this dies to that. Unless you have a nice arch you can shoot it over. The same goes for Kislev, but they have little Grom and they also have guns. There just isn't that much you'd want to use this thing on, frankly. It's not. I feel like in Warhammer, when Immortal Empires comes out, it might be better. But if we start going down the rabbit hole of everything being better in Immortal Empires, we have new tier lists to make, which we'll probably do when Immortal Empires comes out. But just as it stands, C tier currently. I think this is the Ogre Crushers with great weapons, very similar to man-eaters with great weapons, except for these are outrageously expensive. These guys are so expensive. It's really not worth it. There are easier ways to do what these guys are trying to do. A regular Mournfang Cav can fulfill pretty much the same requirement. These guys are just way too expensive. Not that they're bad. Again, it's ogres. They're not a bad unit. They're just really expensive for what they are. If they were cheaper, they'd be OP, frankly. So, They're probably not going to get any cheaper, and they're probably going to stay quite the same as they are. I just realised there's an ad down here. Get out of the way, ad. So yeah, they just are just a tad too expensive for what they are. But they are just basically giant monstrous cav that do have anti-large. But they have no shield as well, which means they get shot to pieces. They're man-eaters, but they're more expensive and they're mounted. But the mountedness doesn't really help much. Next is I think it's just called the Giant. It might be called the Slave Giant. I can't quite remember. That might be something else. It's a Giant. Runs into all the same problems that a Giant does. It's big, slow, and it gets shot to pieces. We're not in a currently, like Warhammer 3, obviously there's a lot more factions that, like relative in terms of percentage, there's more factions that can't actually deal with the Giant as well, compared to Warhammer 2. It's still not good. Like, there's not much, that which you want to fight will just run away from you. So, it's just not that good, and it'll just get shot to pieces otherwise. But it's a single entity that's a bit better than a Stonehorn. Or is it? Maybe I want to move that. Maybe Giant goes to D tier. Why would it keep a Giant? Well, see, a Giant can beat enemy single entities, whereas a Stonehorn is anti-infantry, which Ogres do not struggle with in the slightest. Unless it's like Spear Infantry, which at that point, you're not bringing a Stonehorn, you're just probably shooting them. There is an argument to be made, whereas Giants can do really well against things like Bear Cav and Lords that are big single entities and are annoying to deal with sometimes for Ogres, because Giants just hit so hard and so often. So yeah, no, keep Giants in C. Keep Giants in C, they'll be right. Next, Iron Guts. These guys are literally your mid-tier infantry for some reason. They're just so mid. They're mid on the tier list, they're mid in their cost, and they're mid in their demeanour. They are just armoured, armour-piercing, not great weapons, they don't have anti-large or anything, they're just armoured and armour-piercing monstrous infantry. That's decent. The fact that I think they're the most armoured unit in the Ogre roster, could be wrong, I know they're very much up there. And to have something nice and armoured is nice, but, you know, they still don't have a shield, so if they get shot by something AP, they're still going to die. But they're not bad, they're pretty good, they're better than man-eaters with great weapons, because they pretty much serve the same purpose, but for much cheaper. And then they're really just not bad. They're really very mid. That's a pretty good term to call them, it's just mid. Which one's here? This one's. I think the pictures are so similar. Like, I know that one's the regular morph. I think that one's the Crushers with Iron Fists. I'm pretty sure that's Crushers with Iron Fists. I'm gonna say that's Crushers with Iron Fists. These guys are cheaper than Crushers with great weapons, and they have a shield, thank God. Which is the main reason why they're higher than B. Because how much damage that the great weapons do, you're fine just bringing the Iron Fists. They do pretty much the same effect, but they have a shield, which is nice, and they're cheaper, which is even nicer. So because of that, they're a nice B. That one I think is Mournfang with great weapons. Again, this is just the fact that they're cheaper than the Crusher variant, much cheaper, and they fulfill very much the same purpose. Yeah, that's pretty much all you need to say about that. Is they're cheaper than this one, but they're just the same. So you just bring this one more. Man-eaters with Iron Fists. Of course, this is a man-eater variant that has a shield, thank God, and more melee defense. So whereas I don't think great weapons get any changes to their stats, at least not good ones. But the Iron Fists actually have more melee defense than regular man-eaters. Of course, they're more expensive, but they have that shield and they have the melee defense, which makes them really, really good stat-wise. If I remember rightly, actually, let me see if I can find it. Oh, there they are. I think I'm right on the page. Yeah, they have 50 melee defense, which is huge for monstrous infantry, and of course they have the silver shield. So because of that, they're going to be there. Man-eaters have immunity psychology. They're just a really, really strong monstrous infantry. They're just a bit on the expensive side, but that's to be expected. Regular man-eaters, very much in the same vein, but they're nice. They're like 150 cheaper, so you'd be fair to compare them on about the same level. Lead Belchers. I think there's Lead Belchers. Yeah, Lead Belchers. These guys, they didn't get touched by the nerfs. What these guys kind of suffer with, for some unknown reason, is they have god-awful melee stats. Like, really bad. Like, you wouldn't expect ogres with a giant, like, rod of Mel to be bad in melee, but they're bad for some reason. And it's because of that, they have really good damage output. They're basically your missile infantry. They're your Shabdi Great Bow, they're your deck gunners, they're your Jezzails, they're all those kinds of infantry. They're pretty solid in their damage output. Pretty good even. I'd say A tier. Why did I put them in B tier? I'd say these guys are a way of dealing with really expensive halberds because they just put out so much damage. The issue they have, you know what? I suppose the issue they have is Furies. Like against Kislev and Cathay, these guys are nice. Even if they do lose the cannons, they just tend to put out good damage output on elite infantry. But it's, yeah, I suppose it is because Furies exist. Because Furies, I'm pretty sure every single Fury variant will beat these guys in a fight, which is just sad. Yeah, okay, they stand beta. Iron Blaster, this is your big single entity cannon that everyone was, very angry about when it first came out. It's since been nerfed. It wasn't hit as hard as Gorges were. It was still hit pretty hard. It's no longer deleting units as well as it used to, at least. Its accuracy was way nerfed down, so now it fires just a spray. It's like firing a buck shotgun in a direction. You might hit something. If you're really lucky, you might hit the same unit twice with the three cannonballs it fires. But it's not nearly as OP as it was, and it's just very mid. I hate to use that. We're on the B tier, but it's just mid. It's fine. The fact that it's a chariot only really helps it for speed. Like nobody's charging this thing into melee very often. Yeah. It's nice when you hit something. If you've got things that are dealing with close, if you're dealing with like Nurgle, a nice slow faction, or if you're maybe in the Ogre mirror match, then it's nice. It's just that you don't see that too often. And against like any Fury faction, again, you run into Furies. Nurgle Furies not so much because they don't have the same amount of stats, and you can respond quite quickly to Nurgle Furies because it's Nurgle. But I mean, it's not bad. It's again same level sort of lead belchers. It's just more of a focused select role where the Iron Blaster. I'd say the Iron Blaster is just worse than lead belchers these days. It's not such to worse an extent that I'd actually like move it down a tier, but it's not like they're filling in different roles. They're very much filling the same role. Iron Blaster is just very slightly worse. But also more survivable. Like lead belchers, like I said, will die so quickly. Iron Blaster is a single entity, meaning it's kind of hard to kill when it's just running away. So if you're worried about those Furies, then bring the Iron Blaster. Yeah, if you're not worried about Furies, bring the lead belchers. It does depend on how you feel about dealing with Furies. Man-eaters with great with pistols. These guys are something that people don't think about too often, which is why I think they probably, when people figure them out a bit better, they'll be worse. But these days, people are still trying to figure them out in the fact that you don't expect to fight them when you're going up against ogres. They're such an out of left field unit in terms of ogre kingdoms. They're a missile infantry, but it's also really, really good in melee. They're pretty much a melee unit with a pistol that does way too much damage. I mean, I get it's an ogre pistol, so it's basically firing cannonballs, but that's still a lot of damage. And it's quite good. It does play out quite well. These guys can unexpectedly delete single entities more than lead belchers will. They'll kill single entities a lot quicker than lead belchers. Even quicker than an Iron Blaster at point blank, frankly. And you see them, and you can't really do anything about them, because if you charge them, you'll lose, because they're still man-eaters. The only issue they have is, again, their price. If there was like a cheaper variant of them, or the Ogre Bull variant, they'd probably be insanely good, which is probably why they limited them just to man-eaters. It's just the price, realistically. Like, the fact that you can only really bring one or two of these is the only reason why they're A and not S. Otherwise they would be S, but it's like, they're just so good. Their bullets kill anything large. The only thing they don't do well against is infantry in terms of the ranged unit, the part of them, but of course once they get into melee they'll beat the ranged unit. There's very few units these guys don't perform well against. If it's a large unit, they shoot it. If it's an infantry unit, they just hit it, and because they're man-eaters, they usually win. But again, it's just really the price that's holding them back. The fact that you can't bring too many of them, and the fact that they're not always that useful if the enemy can tie them down quick enough. Now the next one to Ogre Bulls, the nice cheap monstrous infantry unit. Ogre Bulls with Iron Fists. These are the shielded variant. Very good. I think the fact that you can get monstrous infantry for like around the 500-600 gold mark is just really, really good. It's what sells the Ogre Kingdoms, is the fact that you can just get monstrous infantry for that cheap. The fact that you can get splash attacks that hit hard for good weapon strength and decent health pools and just good stats overall for the cost, and you can get it at that level. It's what makes the Ogre Kingdoms, and giving them a shield and extra melee defense is a fine option. To be honest, all the Ogre Bull units are very comparable. I think that just because of how cheap you can get regular Ogre Bulls, they're S tier, but they're not like bad by any means. That being the Iron Fist variant, they're just the fact that they're a bit more expensive sort of moves away from the fact that you're getting them for so cheap, and more towards the fact that they have better stats, which at that point you're starting to move towards man-eaters, but they're still very solid. As Saber Tusk pack, they fill the exact hole that the ogres need. They're a very fast-moving unit that can clear out ranged units, which of course ogres struggle with because they just have very good damage output. So against all those archers, all those artillery, even just rear charging, these guys do really, really well. They are corn dogs, that being corn flesh hounds, that's the one, yeah. But they don't have the physical resistance, and they are not demons. So they're worse than corn hounds, but they're still very good. Especially good in the ogre roster because they fill such a hole. Noblar trappers, you wouldn't think you see Noblars this high, but Noblars are surprisingly good. Noblar trappers, a little underused part of them. They are, in terms of stats, they're exactly the same as Noblars, I think, but they have a ranged attack, so they can throw sticks at people. That's not the main selling point. The main selling point is the fact they have Noblar traps, which is an ability they get, which means if they are attacked while they're standing still, the attacking unit takes like a lot of damage, like a surprisingly large amount of damage, like about the same amount of damage as they will do in melee fighting it until they run, which can really, really like throw people off guard. Not to mention these guys have Stalk, which can play in for some nice sneaky ambush strats. And the fact that they're a cheap, albeit short-ranged missile infantry, that has a good quantity, and they're a regular infantry, so you can mix them in with your normal ogres, and the ogres can like use them as basically a meat shield. Of course, you go for regular noblars usually, but they're only 450 gold. They have Stalk, they have the Noblar traps, they have a throwing weapon. So much utility in such a itty-bitty unit. Really, really good, solid. Of course, they'll get trampled by everything because they're Noblars, but you don't expect them to win. You just expect them to do pretty good damage and be annoying, which they do quite well. Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. These are the anti-infantry variant. I'd say of the three Ogre Bulls, these are the worst, but they're not bad by any means. Again, you play into the cost of they're just such a cheap unit, and the fact that they do surprisingly well against demons, because demons are unarmored and these guys don't have AP. If you manage to give them the magic attack from a flaming sorcerer, these guys will cleave through bloodletters, plague bearers, demonettes, etc., and do very well for it. And of course, against Kislev and Cathay infantry, they do just as well, as long as it's not too armored. Like we're not talking Zargard or anything. We're just talking like the old peasants or Kossars or something. They cleave through. Now again, it's only against infantry using these. Of course, if you're up against anything else, you bring something else. But they're by no means bad, and they're pretty good for the stats there and the cost you're getting once again. Up next we have the Mournfang Cavalry. This is your cheapest cavalry option. This is regular Mournfangs. These guys are just quite good. Like ogres are not slow, so it's not like they're filling that much a hole, but when you've got a very fast moving unit with this much mass, these guys will just trample through any unit of infantry and then just keep going. They're what Stonehorns are, but they're cheaper. There's like 12 of them, and they just tend to perform way better, and they don't get as prone to being shot at because they're smaller targets. Overall, Mournfang Cav are just really, really good. Like, I didn't think very highly of them in Warhammer 2 when they were part of the Mercenary add-on edition, but I did actually notice, especially with other factions, how well they performed. I've only sort of noticed that now, to be honest. I think I had a bias against them for some reason. Probably because they're a campaign exclusive. But they are not as nearly as bad as I thought they were. They are really, really good. Of course, here up at S tier, we can see that we've got the Iron Fist variant. That's just because they have the shield. The melee defense is nice and all, but you are typically just running these guys through infantry. And they will also beat cavalry because they have the AP and the large weapon strength and the splash attack and the fact that they're huge and they have a lot of health. And they have good armor as well, especially more armor if you give them an Iron Fist. I think they get really big armor. I think they get like 110. They get a lot. Regular Mournfang Cav A are nice and like a cheaper alternative if you aren't willing to splurge that much. But I think for the S tier, being that the best cavalry in the Ogre Kingdoms is the Iron Fist, just because they're cheap. They beat nearly everything, and they have a shield, which is always nice for ogres. Of course, how could we look at S tier without talking about what I think are the best 2 units in the roster? That being the classic Noblars and Ogre Bulls. Oh boy, regular Noblars and Ogre Bulls. If you think about it, that's a 750, a single unit of Noblars and a single unit of Ogre Bulls. I can tell you with pretty good certainty that a single unit of Noblars and a single unit of Ogre Bulls would beat, like, anything. Any single frontline infantry that you'd bring, yeah, that'd beat everything. I'll beat a normal spearman unit. I'm pretty sure that I'll beat halberds. I think I'll beat jade warriors. I think it beats bloodletters. I think it beats corn warriors. And for the cost, and the fact that they're so maneuverable, and they have the leadership, and that they can, I mean, in terms of they don't disintegrate on the spot. They run away, they come back, you can flank them around, you can move them left and right. They're 2 separate units. Noblars, specifically talking about Noblars, they're so cheap. 200 is insanely cheap. And who doesn't like chaff in an army full of expensive monstrous infantry? They just fill the role so well, and it's so clear that they are needed in the roster. I feel like this is exactly what was going through Games Workshop's head when they first designed Ogre Kingdoms. They just needed chaff, so they just gave them Noblars. For no other reason than they needed chaff, so here, have Noblars. And they work so well in the roster. You aren't going a single Ogre Kingdoms game where you're not bringing Noblars, and very much the same breath, there's not really a single Ogre Kingdoms game that you're not bringing Ogre Bulls. Ogre Bulls and Noblars are such a staple in the roster. They fulfill so many roles for such a cheap cost. They're not always going to win, but they'll do a lot of damage. They'll definitely get their value. They'll almost always get their value. I can't remember the last time I didn't see even Noblar units tend to get their value just because they fight longer than you'd expect. And Ogre Bulls definitely get their value for the cost. Without you even need to think about it. It's not like people are going to focus these things down. You would just throw these in a normal frontline fight and you'd be surprised how well they do, and the opponent will probably also be surprised by how well they do. I will be very interested to see how these guys perform out with Warhammer 2, but as it stands in Warhammer 3, against demons, against Cathay, against really just everything, even a mirror match, you still use these guys in your frontline. Just because of how well they work in tandem, and just because of how well they are as standalone units. Whew. Ooh, okay, well that is the recover of these 2 tier lists. I hope you all enjoyed. I shall post this up as a substitute for this week's mentor stream. Thank you all for watching, and I shall see you next week for some replays and battles. Let's go. Goodbye.